Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Marcela Echeverri, Assistant Professor of History at Yale University. She is an interdisciplinary scholar with a background in anthropology and political theory. Professor Echeverri's research and teaching interests focus on the relationship between political subjectivities and social transformation in Latin America from colonial times to the present. Today we talk with her about her forthcoming book, Indian and Black Royalists in the Age of Revolutions, Empire and Politics in the Northern Andes, 1780 to 1825. Welcome, Professor Echeverri.
Thank you.
Well, let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
So the book, as you just said, is focused on the 1780 to 1825 period, which falls squarely within the Age of Revolutions, which is a moment when most of the Atlantic world is in upheaval, and there's transformations in the political systems of what at that moment were colonies of the European empires.
Okay.
And so basically I look at the Latin American wars of independence, so essentially the moment when Spain is being rejected by people across what at that time were the colonies, but of course we have to think about the fact that these were not yet the nations that we think about today.
Okay.
So I focus on what is Colombia today, but was called New Granada at that time.
Okay.
Specifically the southwestern region of this Viceroyalty of New Granada, where there were important numbers of indigenous people and African descendant people who were enslaved, and also some of them free. So during the independence wars, this becomes a region where most of the people mobilize in favor of the Spanish crown. So particularly, interestingly, not in favor of the independence cause.
Okay.
I look at why this happened. So the guiding question of my book is how to explain why indigenous people and people of African descent, who we would normally expect to be against the empire or to have anti-colonial interests, are actually acting in favor of the empire and in favor of the monarchy.
Okay.
And the way that I do this is by, as I said, I don't begin in the 1809 moment when the wars of independence actually begin, but I go back in time into the colonial period, and I look at how exactly the political relations and the political identities of these people, indigenous people, people of African descent, both free and enslaved, were framed within the Spanish monarchy and the Spanish empire.
Okay.
So this is the first part of the book, and it's actually then followed by the core of the manuscript, which focuses on the independence wars. And that's the part where I look at more how the contingency throughout the wars is going to affect the positioning of these people as royalists in the independence process. So essentially the book is contributing to a number of fields because it's looking at indigenous people and people of African descent in the same frame, which is not very usual for Latin American history and Atlantic history more broadly. And it also really rethinks the politics of indigenous people and people of African descent in the context of the Age of Revolutions.
Okay. What led you to write the book?
So as you said, I have a background in anthropology and political theory, so I had already been quite interested in discourses or notions about otherness in Latin America. And the moment of the independence process becomes really crucial for understanding how we think about the role of what today are mostly minorities in Latin American nations in the construction of the nation state. So I was reading a lot and thinking a lot about how to incorporate these people into these narratives of nation state formation. But I came across the interesting and by all means paradoxical case of these royalists in southwestern New Granada. And there were always mentions of them, but generally just by passing. There was no real problematization or even attempt to explain it. they emerged, first of all, during the 19th century in the context of the independence wars, when Simón Bolívar, whom most of the people have heard about because he was quite important in finalizing the independence of the South American region. And so he was trying to go south into Peru to have a connection with the southern independence movement, and he was precisely blocked in this region that I study, in the Popayán region and the southwest of Colombia, because the Royalists were so prominent and so successful for so long, between 1809 and the 1820s. And so, again, I was looking at how these Royalists were portrayed in the nationalist narratives written in the 19th century, and usually you would find references to the fact that they had been quite backward, or that they were somewhat fanatical in religious terms, that they were really not able to kind of grapple the situation and the opportunities that obviously the anti-colonial movements were posing or finding. And so this for me was completely insufficient. And interestingly, I didn't only find these types of explanations in the 19th century literature, but I started to see it, how it reverberated somehow in the contemporary understandings that scholars handle about, again, minorities, ethnic minorities, who are sometimes thought to have a certain type, or scholars, historians, social scientists expect them to have a certain type of political identity or political consciousness. And so what I'm referring to more specifically is, for example, there are like two sides of this debate. On the one hand, thinking about indigenous people or people of African descent being naturally anti-colonial, like I was saying before. That's why people would normally expect them to be on the insurgent side. Or some people, even the 19th century scholars, would say, well, definitely we can expect them to be royalists, we can expect them to be in favor of the crown, precisely because they are so backward and their political consciousness is so insufficient and so unsophisticated, if you will, that then that explains everything, and that would be where the two sides were. And for me, this became an incredible opportunity to revisit the historical moment and to think about the process from the point of view of the historical actors. And at the same time, I would be contributing, of course, to the literature and to our thinking about nation-state formation, about colonial history more broadly, and of course about the politics and the political consciousness of the popular classes in Latin America and the Atlantic world.
Okay, very interesting. I would love for you to tell us, what you found when you examined the period prior to the independence, in terms of, what did you find about the people? How do you explain their embrace of Spain versus not embracing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's exactly where the whole story begins, and where my methodological approach becomes important.
And yes, I am going to ask you how you did your research too, so by all means.
So should I move into that one already?
However you'd like to approach it.
Because part of the point here is that because we are thinking from the present point of view, we tend to already assume the way that things are going to evolve, right?
Yeah.
So one of the challenges that I myself have to be reminded of, but also that is the conclusion of how this project has evolved, is that when we go back in time, we don't know that outcome, and we can actually think about the process in a more open-ended way, right? So what I'm trying to get to here is that perhaps we shouldn't talk about this in terms of why they didn't embrace the independence movement, because that is assuming that the independence movement in itself exists as something given, when the moment actually begs the possibility that these things were much more incoherent, that ideologies were not as clear-cut as we tend to want to remember them and reconstruct them. So this was happening not only in the royalist side, but also in the independence or insurgent side, right? And this is something that, of course, has been quite well developed recently in the historiography as a whole, trying to rethink the independence movement, perhaps by questioning the possibility that these people were envisioning independence from the beginning of, let's say, 1808, 1809. Mm-hmm. That obviously leaves open the possibility of thinking about the Royalists in the same terms, how they envisioned transformations within the monarchy and within the empire. Mm-hmm. And so by looking at the late colonial context, and here we're talking about 1780s, which is already, as I said before, within the age of revolutions, which means that there's already incredible transformations taking place in the hemisphere. Nonetheless, what I'm trying to get to is how the political identities and the legal identities of these people, indigenous people, enslaved and free people of African descent, are really in dialogue with the monarchical framework. So that means that it's very hard for them to necessarily envision something outside, because what they're doing is actually having a dialogue, having a conversation within the possibilities that they have at that time. Mm-hmm. So in terms of how I did the research, this is also important because the fact that indigenous people and people of African descent were generally excluded from narratives of independence and modern state formation, modernization more broadly in Latin America, has to do with the fact that they are relatively absent as voices, as explicit voices, producers of documents in the sources that us historians use to do our research. Of course, it's an incredible challenge, and for a long time people used this argument to actually, let's say, comfortably exclude them from the narrative. But of course, this has been challenged and transformed, and it has been an object of incredible epistemological reflection among scholars. And so what I did was basically use documents that were not produced by these subjects, by indigenous people or by people of African descent, but that of course reflected some of their actions and some of their positioning throughout the war and throughout the late colonial period, and that when they're read creatively, you can actually get to important elements of their importance during the process. So I'm thinking mostly, of course, letters, sermons, correspondence between colonial officials and military officials, because something crucial that I have to explain here is that I've been interested both in the legal dimension of this process. So in other words, as I said before, how the legal identities of indigenous people, free people, and slaves are constructed within the monarchical context. But I'm also very interested, especially in the independence wars, in the process of the rise of military opportunities for them to become, of course, political actors in the whole context of the war. So that's why military documents also became crucial, and I did my research in Spain, in Ecuador, because the archives that hold documents for this region of southwestern Colombia are actually in Quito. Also the John Carter Brown Library here in Providence, Rhode Island, and of course Colombia, Bogota.
Okay. So when you were doing your research, did you come across anything that surprised you that you weren't anticipating or perhaps expecting?
Yes, and it's interesting because it has to do precisely with the challenges that the project posed for myself, as much as I wanted to really break out of some of the most limiting preconceptions about these people and about the region. It took some time to realize, for example, that I had to completely strip away this topic, and particularly the people that I was studying in southwestern New Granada, of their connection with New Granada's center, which is Santa Fe, because Santa Fe is going to very early on start to experiment with independence and autonomous rule, but So if I continue to frame the story within the Colombian history, which is ultimately where it today still stands, right? Because we tend to project back Colombia, the country, the region, the geography, into the past. And of course, that would lead to think maybe I'm writing Colombian history of the 19th century.
Right.
But in fact, that became a huge obstacle for me to really understand the dynamics of these royalist people. And eventually I ended up making the connection with actually the South, which is the Peruvian viceroyalty that remained as a royalist stronghold pretty much until, I was telling you before, until Simón Bolívar finally is able to cross south and basically disarticulate this very strong Spanish stronghold. But throughout the time of the wars of independence, Popayán, the region that I look at, is actually tied to Peru, and that really explains why it's able to maintain itself both politically and militarily during the war. So it really entailed breaking away from the framework of colonial history completely and entirely to start to think about the royalists really in a more positive and creative way, instead of thinking about them in the framework of colonial history that is relatively based on negative perspective that these people are anti-Colombian, right, anti-Republican. Try to think about them beyond that negative conception that we have inherited.
And when you look beyond that negative perception, what do you found? What are the characteristics? Why did they embrace Spain? Why did they not want to go off on their own, for instance?
Why did they not want to go on their own? Well, interestingly, and this allows me to expand a little more on what's happening in Spain itself.
Okay.
Because after 1809, the Spanish monarchy enters into a huge crisis. Napoleon Bonaparte invades Madrid and basically takes over the government. And there's a small group of Spanish liberals that move to the south of Spain in Cádiz, and they start to create an insistent resistance against the Napoleonic invasion. And they're able to maintain connections with the Spanish American territory that, again, here is when they start to really stumble and experiment with autonomy, because they realize that the government in Spain is no longer there, and that leaves a huge space for experimentation. But on the other hand, this is also a moment when, as I find in my research and writing my book, the people from what we might call these royalist enclaves or bulwarks are going to negotiate their positioning within the monarchy in the new terms in a very open-ended and flexible manner, because of course, as I was saying before, as much as the independence project is an open-ended project, the royalists as well are reinventing what it means to be part of this monarchical system and what it means to be a Spanish vassal. So when you think about indigenous people, to give you another example or a more concrete example, people are really trying to think about how to negotiate taxes, for example, or how to negotiate community, who has authority to do what and on what terms. Of course, military relations here play a huge role.
Right.
When you think about slaves, of course, freedom becomes a huge element of negotiation. But it's not simply freedom in a vacuum, or it's not freedom like we tend to think about it, like as an abstract value, but it really is freedom constructed within these monarchical relations and negotiating in terms of what it means to be part of the monarchy according to what they need to have. And I should clarify that these are slaves that are working mostly in the Pacific region of New Granada. So the work really does have like two different landscapes in which this war is taking place. The Andean region, where most of the indigenous people are, and the Pacific lowlands, where most of the people of African descent, free and enslaved, are living.
And then lastly, what do you conclude in your book?
So there's a couple of things, and I think as I introduced the whole project, this is clearly a work that illustrates the importance of moving away from conceptual very rigid categories. For example, to move away from dichotomies between reactionary and revolutionary, because the work really allows me to redefine what it means to be political in this period, and to think in a more open-ended way about the politics of indigenous people and people of African descent. Regarding the broader context, for example, of the Age of Revolution history, it's important to remind ourselves that for the most part, the history of the Age of Revolutions has been written from a North Atlantic perspective, and so we know a lot about, you know, U.S. Revolution, and we also know a lot about the Haitian Revolution, and these are stories that really do tend to privilege the revolutionary trope, and that fit really well with this idea of radical breaks. But I think that if we move into this Pacific Andean region, which is where I am focusing my study, we really gain a lot in understanding the complexity and the diversity of the politics of people, of course, from all classes. And so in that sense, for example, the Latin American case really adds our understanding of breaking away from, again, from the dichotomies that we're so used to, that liberalism and royalism in the Latin American case and in the case that I study are not necessarily opposites, for example, because as I was telling you, the liberal project that evolves in the Spanish Peninsula is eventually going to be crucial for the way in which royalist, let's say, loyalties are going to be redefined during this period. So ultimately, people are thinking about a loyalty to the crown that is, in a large extent, liberal. And these are things that people don't necessarily put together very often when they think about the history of this period.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Echeverri and her work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.